This module is entitled Advanced and Traditional Resistance Training for Youth Football or Soccer Athletes. Now, resistance training for children has been accepted widely by a number of associations across the world in many review articles. As you can see, the American College of Sports Medicine, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Australian and the British and the Canadian, and the National Strength and Conditioning Association all recommend resistance training for children for both health and performance. There have been review articles for the past 20 years that have indicated that resistance training is safe, healthy, and progressive for children. When you take a look at the articles throughout the years, we see that resistance training for children has strong evidence for improving muscle strength. We see, though, that there's not as much evidence when it comes to the improvements in power. The reason for that is there's not many articles or research looking at power in children, and thus it's difficult to ascertain whether resistance training alone will improve power. So this is an area that we must look at. So our objectives for this video is what is the logical training sequence to implement power training with children? Secondly, do plyometrics and Olympic weightlifting increase power or explosive strength in children? So the first thing we have to worry about is the balance in children. Children are not fully developed in terms of their balance and their equilibrium. And it might be beneficial to start off with just balance training rather than resistance training in children to fully explore and fully augment their balance capabilities. So we need to include specific exercises that require balance and coordination. Now, when we take a look at the adult studies that use balance training, we see that balance decreases force and strength, power, and range of motion when you're using instability in adults. We can see from this slide here that when you take from our review all the studies together, in general there's about a 25% decrease in these performance measures. Now there's a saying that's called old man strength. Now what does old man strength mean? Well, if we had two people going for the ball, and we had a 27-year-old who was 80 kilograms, and we have a 17-year-old who is also 80 kilograms, they both have the same body fat percentage. They both have the same lean mass. So they're both the same muscle. Who would get that ball? Well, I would suggest that it would be the older man. It would be the adult who would get that ball. And why would that be? Well, that's because the adult has better balance, stability, and coordination. They're able to use their strength better because they have better stability. And so we need to work on that in young people for them to exploit their newfound strength and power. We have another saying in Canada: you can't shoot a cannon from a canoe. When we take a look at this figure, we see this big gun. You can have a big gun, but if you don't have a solid base to fire that gun, we obviously know what's going to happen to that canoe. It's going to fall right over. So if you want to shoot a big gun, you need a solid base. This is a big gun, but it's also got a solid base. So when we take a look at this warship, we can shoot large guns because it's got a solid core, a very strong core, and you can shoot a strong gun. That gun can be your legs kicking a ball. That gun can be your arms striking something. So in order to strike the ball, we need a solid core, and we have to work on that core. Now, what is the effect of balance training alone just on balance? Well, whether we're looking at adults, whether we're looking at older people, seniors, or whether we're looking at youth, we typically see that a balance training program will improve balance by about 25%, irrespective of the person's age. If we take a look at the effect size, which means the magnitude of change, the magnitude of change is always large. We see here the effect size, if it's over 0.8, means it's always large. So we have very large effect sizes in all age groups. When we take a look at particular studies, such as the ones by Urs Gronecker, Urs Gronecker did a 4-week balance training study with high school athletes. And just by doing balance, no resistance training, no power training, These youth improved their postural control, their jump height, and they enhanced their rate of force development. He also did the same study with grade 1 students. But what he found was that the balance training tended not to provide any substantial benefits. The reason for that, he surmised, was that the children didn't have the attentional focus. They didn't have the emotional maturity to actually do the program properly. So there may be an age at which you can apply this balance training programs. And perhaps at 6 or 7 years old, it might be a little young, but as they move into pre-adolescence or pre-puberty, it certainly provides performance benefits. Now, what about static balance? We did an adult study where we had individuals train for 5 weeks. Again, all they did was balance training. And in that study, they increased their static balance by 33%. They improved their jump height by 9%. So the question is, how can you improve jump height just by improving your balance? Well, the reason is that an adult or a human works like an inverted pendulum. I can stand here and try to stand as still as possible, but it is impossible for anybody to be completely still. As I stand here, my body moves back and forth, moves side to side. My body wants to try and maintain my center of gravity within the base of support. An individual with poor balance and they try to do a jump may take off at a 5 degree from the vertical or a 9 degree from the vertical. After balance training, the individual will be better at maintaining their base of support and keeping it inside so that when they take off more vertically. They have a better takeoff, propulsion. What we also need to work on in balance training is the landing technique. We know from previous studies that ballerinas, ballet dancers, have less knee injuries than basketball or netball players. And why would that be? Because ballet dancers work on their landing. They want to be graceful when they land. So they prepare, they anticipate their landing. Young athletes may not work on their landing technique and may be more susceptible to injury. And as we know, if you're not balanced, you decrease your force, you decrease your power. Thus, it's very important for our young athletes as well as our young adult athletes to work on their balance in order to have better landing technique. Then they can power off from that position. We also see in a study that we did that static balance is correlated with ice skating speed. We showed that there's a correlation between young people and their ice skating speed of 0.65. So once again, that improved balance allowed them to exert higher forces and higher power. Now, balance training studies report increases not only in balance but also in performance. We can see here from the review that we did in 2011 that just by improving balance, we will improve performance on average by over 30%. We see here, we have some photos of my lovely daughter performing some balance exercises that can be used in training. So what about doing strength training on unstable surfaces? In a review study that we did in 2015, we looked at a number of different studies, and we found that when you perform unstable resistance training exercises, that of course you become stronger and more powerful than you would if you do no exercises at all. However, comparing unstable resistance training to stable resistance training, there is no major difference. Therefore, you could argue that unstable resistance training is no better than stable, and therefore we should be doing stable resistance training. However, there are reasons such as increased muscle activation why you may want to do unstable resistance training with youth, as well as improving that balance. Another advantage of doing unstable resistance training is that you have higher core activation. Remember before we mentioned about shooting the big guns and we need a strong core. When you take a look at the literature for adults we see that on average, that you tend to increase your trunk or core activation by about 50% more than when you're in a stable environment. So there's much higher core activation when you're unstable. So what are the advantages of doing balance training? Well, first of all, because you have the high activation and the stability, you can start off by just using your body weight as resistance. You can also use various balance and stability challenges to improve a person's equilibrium. There's higher core and trunk activation. Since we play sports on unstable environments, we play football on muddy fields, we change direction, we're bounced and pushed, there is training specificity involved. And of course, if we're doing these exercises, there's a variety of things that we can do that can make it very fun for the child. So what about plyometrics? What about advanced resistance training techniques? If we take a look at the Essentials of Strength and Conditioning textbook, it tells us that we need to leg press 1.5 times our body weight before we can start doing plyometrics. Now, what are plyometrics? Plyometrics are activities that involve bounding and bouncing. They involve the stretch shortening cycle, whereby we might be doing skipping, jumping off of platforms. Now, a common definition of plyometrics refers to high-intensity jumps, where you're jumping off platforms. But that may be a very narrow definition of plyometrics. If you think of children do plyometrics all the time. If they're skipping, they're doing plyometrics. Who would tell a child that they can't skip? Who would tell a child that they can't bounce or run? These are all plyometrics. So we need to define what we need by plyometrics. Most people would agree that pre-pubertal children should not engage in high-intensity plyometrics. For example, jumping from a 1-meter platform down and doing drop jumps. Because again, their balance is not fully developed. But plyometrics can be done in children when it's low intensity, when it's low amplitude. In a study that we did where we combined plyometrics and balance training, we showed that when you combined plyometrics with balance training, we got better improvements. We see in this study here that in the boxes that the combination of plyometrics and balance typically had much better results than plyometrics alone. The interesting thing about this study was that they only did half as much plyometrics as in the group that did plyometrics and balance. So with half the plyometric work, they improved their performance in strength measures and in power measures by adding balance to their routine. We see here that we moved on and did another study. In this study, we decided, well, what is the sequence that is optimal for plyometric and balance training? Should we do balance before plyometrics? Or should we do plyometric training followed by balance? What you can see in these graphs is that the figures that show BPT, balance before plyometric training, always had better results. So they had better results in terms of strength, they had better results in terms of power, they had better results in terms of balance. So if, once again, we want to emphasize the importance of ensuring that a child has optimal balance before they move on to more advanced techniques. Because without that optimal balance, they will not achieve their greatest results. So the recommendations are that individuals should start plyometric training with less intense drills. Again, it should be double leg jumps, 2 leg jumps before a single leg jump. They should do this until their competence and their confidence improves. They don't need a high workload to get positive results. Studies show that we can do less than 10 repetitions and still get these strength gains. We also, as mentioned before, we want to emphasize their proper positioning in terms of landing to get the best balance. A number of other studies, for instance, a meta-analysis by Johnson, showed that plyometric training had very large positive effects on jumping and running performance. I co-authored and led a study or a position stand by the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology. And based on a review of the literature, we recommended that plyometric training can be safe and effective for enhancing muscle power in children. There's a number of other studies that have also showed that plyometric training can improve jump height and running speed in children. And another meta-analysis by Behringer showed that the transfer of these resistance training gains to motor performance in youth had high effect sizes when you combine plyometrics with traditional resistance training. So once again, we need that progression. We need to have balance and then traditional resistance training and then move into more advanced resistance training. Now, what about Olympic weightlifting? Olympic weightlifting is quite an advanced type of training. Is this appropriate for children? Well, Olympic weightlifting is very important in terms of training specificity. When we take a look at this cartoon, we see that it's a very powerful type of activity. A study that I did back in 1993 showed that it was the intent to contract explosively that was very important. It didn't matter how fast the limb moved. If you exploded into the weight, then you had a very explosive and a high velocity specific training effect. We can see here when the person's performing a clean that the person explodes off the floor, and if we look at their feet, they're actually coming off the floor, like they're jumping, but they're jumping against resistance. So here we're exploding off the ground from an athletic position. What do I mean by an athletic position? Well, once again, I have my daughter here. And what sport is my daughter playing from this athletic position? Well, she could be playing a lot of different sports. She could be playing basketball from this athletic position. She could be playing volleyball. Once again, look at her feet. She's exploding off the ground in the exact same manner that we do with a clean in Olympic weightlifting. Being from Canada, obviously, she's got to play ice hockey, so she's taken an ice hockey position, just like her dear old dad did way back when on the right-hand side. She could be playing American football. Again, dear old dad, his number 32, also played American football, actually Canadian football. So, Olympic-style lifts involve a very complex neuroactivation pattern, and therefore the children need to learn these patterns beforehand in order to provide a safe environment and a progressive environment. And therefore they have to start with a light load. They should start perhaps with a broom handle in order to get that kind of movement pattern optimized. Now there's a few studies that have used Olympic weightlifting. For instance, Ibata et al. In 2011 had children involved in Olympic weightlifting for 3 months. And on average, they're about 13 years old. And they showed about a 5% increase in strength gains such as snatch, cleans, and squats. In another program, which was 8 weeks in length, they compared Olympic weightlifting and traditional closed-linked tasks such as squats and deadlifts. And in this one, they were about 16 years old. Again, the Olympic weightlifting showed an advantage over the traditional resistance training in terms of conventional power measures. Now, what about this little guy? Is this guy too young to be able to do weightlifting? Well, let's watch this video right here. Take a look at his technique. We can see from this video that if properly trained, even young children can perform these very advanced moves. So we decided to compare in one of our studies Olympic weightlifting and plyometric training. And what we wanted to take a look at was, in this case, of course, Olympic weightlifting, as we mentioned, is very complex. Is the complexity of Olympic weightlifting and the ability to learn that going to detract from the short period of time that people are going to train? So we had a 12-week training period which we compared Olympic weightlifting, plyometrics, and traditional resistance training. And we wanted to know, of course, with that learning experience, is it really optimal to use Olympic weightlifting in a short duration period, such as 8 to 12 weeks? So in these graphs here, we're using effect sizes. What you want to look at is the effect size greater than 0.8? Because 0.8 means it's a strong effect size, it's a strong magnitude. So when we take a look at the various measures, we see that Olympic weightlifting was much greater or much stronger than 0.8 in many of these measures. So we see that here, that Olympic weightlifting is always over 0.8, it's always strong. In some measures such as sprinting, we see that traditional resistance training was actually better. But in general, we see that Olympic weightlifting is better or as good as plyometrics or traditional resistance training. So is there a certain window of opportunity in terms of physical maturation? We talk about peak height velocity. Peak height velocity is when children are in their growth spurt. So in peak height velocity, the individuals grow very quickly. They tend to lose their coordination and their balance. During this period, and before peak height velocity, again, balance is immature. So what we want to emphasize during these periods is we want to emphasize coordination. We want to use the broomstick or light loads in order to ensure that the coordination and motor control is optimal. Following peak height velocity, so post-peak height velocity, then we can start adding greater loads. So the individual gets greater stress on their system in order to provide higher strength and greater power. So in summary, resistance training for children or adolescents is beneficial for health and performance. We've seen that for the last 20 years. But due to an immature balance system, we need to work on balance first. We have to improve the children's balance before we move into more advanced types of training. So we start off with balance training without resistance. And then we can follow that by using unstable conditions with low resistance. We can also use traditional closed kinetic chains because doing exercises such as squats and lifts, deadlifts, also provide some balance challenges. But plyometrics and Olympic lifts provide the greatest balance and power challenges, and we can incorporate those progressively and safely with children. We want to introduce those proper techniques for all athletes so we get that training specificity. We want to do it with low amplitude plyometrics to start and then progress to greater challenges. But the important thing is too, for children, the plyometrics and Olympic weightlifting provides variety and provides fun. I appreciate your time and thank you for your interest.